Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. In this episode, we catch up with Tame, PRI's Director of Communications at the State Policy Network General Meeting in Salt Lake City. SPN is an association of more than 60 free market think tanks nationwide. Tim interviews Pete Constant, former councilman of San Jose, and who now leads the Retirement Security Initiative, an advocacy organization focused on protecting and ensuring the fairness and sustainability of public sector retirement plans. RSI helps policymakers learn about pension issues and explore policy options. Pete and Tim discuss the pension crisis in California and Pete's unique perspective as councilman of one of the state's largest cities. Thanks for joining us.
Well, Pete Constant, thank you so much for joining us. We're here at the State Policy Network Conference in Salt Lake City, and you really are one of the most high-profile voices in California on California's pension crisis, and you're working with an organization called the Retirement Security Initiative. So for our listeners who may not be familiar with your organization, tell us about it and some of the work that you're doing.
Great. Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to participate in these type of podcasts, and I thank you for having me here today. The Retirement Security Initiative is a nonprofit organization with a clear bipartisan perspective to pension reform. We have a very well-known board members from across the nation. Dick Ravitch, the former Lieutenant Governor of New York, is on our board, as well as Lois Scott, the former CFO for Mayor Rahm Emanuel in Chicago. Of course, Chuck Reed, the former mayor of San Jose, Dan Lillenquist, the former state senator from the state of Utah, and Jim Spiato, who's an attorney who is best known for his work in really helping to establish the municipal bankruptcy law in the United States. So we've got a board that's really been long-term committed to the issue of public finance, government finance, and public pension issues in specific. Our approach to pensions is pretty simple. We believe that public employees deserve fair compensation for the work that they do, and they have a right to have good, solid security in retirement. But we also believe at the same time the retirement plans that provide these benefits must be affordable. They must be affordable not only in the short term in terms of their normal costs that governments have to pay now, but they have to be affordable for the long term, and they have to be sustainable. And what we're seeing right now is pension plans in crisis coast to coast. Not one, not two, not three, but nearly all pension systems, public pension systems in the United States are in a state of crisis. And that's something that needs to be resolved, because we can't have a situation where people who've dedicated their lives to public service end up retiring with no retirement security whatsoever.
Let's start maybe with exploring the scope of California's pension crisis today. You may have seen PRI's Wayne Weingarten, who's done a lot of work on California's pension crisis, just released what we called a pension chart book, and he explored the real extent of where things stand today. And he found if you use what he considers to be a more realistic estimate, the pension crisis in the Golden State, we call it the pension monster, has nearly $1 trillion. So what are your thoughts on Wayne's findings, and do you think that Californians should be more worried about the state of our pension or public pensions than Sacramento politicians seemingly are today?
Well, I have to tell you that the majority of the public in California, even given all of the media attention that pensions have received over the last few years, the general public is still in the dark as to how bad the crisis is. And it's not only the general public, policymakers. I talk to everyone from local school board members to city council members to mayors to state elected officials that don't realize the extent or the depth of the problem. Now, a few years ago, when people proposed using a more market-based or risk-free based rate of return to look at these pension problems, people thought that was crazy. You know, you can't do that. You have to use an assumed rate of return in the 7s or the 8s, and you need to match your discount rate to that because that's the way we've always done it. And they've really understated the problem. And it goes to the root of the problem. The reason we have this debt is that understated rate of return that they thought that they would get. People were hoping to get 8, 9, 10% in the market, and they were getting 4, 5, 6% in the market. And nobody seems to have learned by using those overstated assumptions. But recently, we've seen a lot of movement towards going to a more realistic or what I call a risk-free rate of return to use as the discount rate. Not only the public publication that you just recently put out, but even the Federal Reserve in the last 2 weeks changed how they account for public pensions, and they're acknowledging that this debt is much more significant. And for those who are in the world of finance and have done some work in trying to figure out the discounted future liabilities, the way we look at it is pretty simple. When you're picking a discount rate to value how big your liabilities are, that discount rate has to be compared to or married to what is your ability to have to make those payments in the future. And, a private business, they don't have that constraint that they must pay because they can just go bankrupt. State governments can't go bankrupt. Employee pension payments are constitutionally guaranteed, and they are in most of the states in the nation by federal contract law. They have some pretty strong guarantees. So when you have no risk of defaulting on your debt, then you must use a conservative discount rate because you are going to have to pay it. And that is the fundamental mistake that almost every pension system in the nation is using. And when you do that, as you've seen in the report, these liabilities climb significantly. In fact, if you go by the numbers that pension systems across the nation use to project their liabilities, it's about $1 trillion nationally. But if you use a more realistic discount rate like we're talking about here, it's really 6 to 7, maybe even $8 trillion. Think about that. People are concerned about the national debt, and they should be, at over $22 trillion. But just public pensions, which aren't included in that, could be $8 to $10 trillion on top of that, and people still aren't worried about addressing it. So I applaud the work, because this is what we need. We need people to see how bad it really is so that hopefully they'll come to the realization that this is something we have to deal with and deal with soon.
For our listeners who are interested in reading the report, you can download it at our website, pacificresearch.org, and you can watch. We made a little video of California's pension monster using the infamous bacteria bear in front of the governor's office, which is very appropriate for Halloween time to watch a real-life horror story. So when people see a number like $1 trillion, I think people's eyes glaze over. I think a lot of people, it's not a realistic number for them. It doesn't really mean anything to them. So on a previous podcast, we talked with David Crane, who's really a brave soul in this fight. And he talked about what he calls the pension crowd out, which is basically all this increased pension spending by local governments and state governments crowds out funding for people's priorities, public safety, parks, healthcare, education, you name it. So, and this is even true even in times like now of record state revenues. So in your view, what will be the real world impact felt by Californians if we don't get public pensions reformed and under control soon?
Well, I think you've hit it on the head there. The crowd out issue is the probably biggest symptom or side effect of the public pension crisis. And it's real, and it's here, and it's everywhere. It's not only at the state levels, it's at every city. I can tell you from personal experience, when I was a city councilman in the city of San Jose, unfortunately I took office right before the Great Recession. Or you could say fortunately, because I got to do some real meaningful work, which it's easy to govern in the good times, a little more difficult in the hard times. But the city of San Jose dealt with over $100 million budget deficits every single year. And when we did an analysis, those deficits were clearly driven by the rising pension costs, specifically the payments to pay off the debt that has been accumulating. The city of San Jose went from having over 1,450 police officers to about 1,050. We had to lay off firefighters. We had to close libraries. We had brand new libraries that were built with fences around them because we couldn't open them. That's the real crowd out. Because let's face it, you have a pie of money. It's like having an apple pie at the dinner table. You can only cut so many slices on it. And as more people come to the party, those slices get smaller and smaller. But if you have one overeater and their piece keeps getting bigger and bigger, everybody else's gets smaller. And that's what's happening. The pension slice of the pie is becoming more than half of the pie in a number of cases. And people are having an extreme problem dealing with the others. And I wish we could just do like we do in my family. We go to Costco and get a supersized apple pie. Well, you can't do that with pensions because the revenue pie doesn't grow by that much. And so as your payments increase to your pension system, they got to come from somewhere. And unfortunately, it comes from those areas that really directly impact the public. You see roadways throughout California disintegrating beneath our feet because roadway maintenance was one of the first things to be cut. You see response times for police and fire lengthening because police forces, even if they haven't been reduced in size, they haven't grown to keep pace with the growing population. You have libraries with cut hours. You You have parks that are getting mowed every other week. You have park districts, like some of the park districts in Northern California, that have actually had to mortgage the parks to pay their pension bill. Think about that. The only reason they exist is to provide parks. Their greatest asset is the delivery of service and the park land that they own, and they've had to mortgage that to pay for the prior service of employees. That's crazy, and it's happening over and over again. And unfortunately, we haven't seen the worst of it yet, because the way CalPERS and other pension systems finance their debt, the debt is backloaded. So we haven't even hit the peak yet. The peak of pension payments won't come till probably 2035, and they're going to steadily go up. I live in a small town of Roseville, California, population about 130,000. So that may be large compared to some cities, but when you've come from San Jose, it's a small town. They have an annual operating budget of about $120 million. Their unfunded pension liability is $350 million. Over the next 30 years, if they stick on their payment plan that CalPERS gives them and they don't incur any new debt, which is doubtful, it will cost them almost $500 million to retire that debt. Every year, $19.5 million comes out of their general fund for debt payments alone. $19 million can deliver you a lot of park maintenance, a lot of roadway improvements, a lot of police officers, a lot of firefighters. And that's what we need to do. This debt's not going to go away, but when we have to look at it, people have been looking at this as a revenue problem. It's not a revenue problem. It's a debt management problem. The debt has not been managed. For 15 years, 18 years, CalPERS has allowed this debt to increase, and they're basically creating what is no different than really a subprime mortgage. We have a subprime mortgage on our employees that we rely on to keep us safe, keep us secure, and keep us enjoying quality of life in our cities, our state. And we've mortgaged their future in a subprime loan. And when that subprime mortgage crisis hits the pension system, you can't just walk away from these retirees. We have a debt to them, and we need to pay it.
So in California, it seems like much of the action on pension reforms, sadly, is not in the legislature where it should be. It's in the courts. There was a recent California Supreme Court ruling that dealt a blow to the citizen-led public employee pension reform ballot measures, and they struck down Proposition B from San Diego. And it seemed like kind of a weird justification in the court ruling that if you're a mayor, you lose your rights as a citizen for dealing with pension reform at the ballot. So what is your takeaway from this ruling, and what impact do you think it will have on future local pension reform efforts and those initiated at the ballot box?
Well, I think the California Supreme Court definitely got that one wrong. It was clearly, there's two methods to get issues to the ballot for local government. One is the initiative, signature gathering initiative process, and the other is the council or the governing body putting it on as a ballot question. This was clearly an initiative drive. The signatures were gathered, the public spoke, and I think this has dealt a blow to sort of the bedrock of self-governance in California. That being said, there's a lot of other issues before the Supreme Court right now. As you know, there's 5 or 6 cases, pension cases pending at the Supreme Court. We just heard last week that the Supreme Court is going to set oral arguments in the CAL FIRE versus CalPERS case probably in November. It's all been briefed. It's ready to go, and I think that case hopefully shines a light of hope for pensions, because remember, it's the Supreme Court that got us in this mess. It was a 1955 ruling of the Supreme Court that created this super protection of pensions in the aspect of public employee pensions, where the court said that once on the day you hire someone, the promise that you make, you are stuck with for the rest of their employment and the rest of their life. There's no way you can modify that, and it's a very odd thing, especially when pensions are a form of compensation. It's deferred compensation, and it's clear that you can change an employee's compensation at any time. You can't take back the money you paid them last year, but you sure as heck can lower their pay this year or not give them an increase that you were planning on, and that's the way it should be for pensions as well. Anything that's been earned and accrued should be protected. People went to work with an expectation that they were earning, they were told they were earning, they accrued that benefit, they should have it. But that doesn't mean when you find yourself in a system that's broken, when you find yourself in a system that is going to collapse if you don't do something, to say we're just going to keep doing it and let it collapse because it's the only option we have. So I really think that the Supreme Court has to get things right this time, because what happens in California affects the rest of the nation. That one case in 1955 in California is followed by most of the states in the nation, and we really have to find a way to fix these things, because the debt is not going to go away.
Governor Brown has been a realist on pension reform, and he's probably gone about as far as you can politically in the makeup of Sacramento today with the modest pension reform measures from 2012. In your view, we're kind of at a time now where we're looking back on Jerry Brown's last 8 and really 16 years as governor. So looking at his what he's done over the years on pension reform, how would you rate his legacy on this issue?
First, I would say I don't think any of us more conservative-minded people in the state thought that as Governor Brown was assuming office in his lightest term as governor, I don't think any of us would have expected him to be the most conservative Democrat in the Capitol. I mean, it's incredible. I think we have to give Governor Brown significant credit for the PEPRA reforms that were passed in 2012 and implemented in 2013. It's not the perfect reform, but it is a very, very good reform. I think, unfortunately, the CalPERS has done a lot to frustrate that reform. And let me give you an example. One of the key elements of Governor Brown's reform was not only changing the formulas, which is what got a lot of the attention, but he changed the allocation of costs so that the cost was borne equally between the employee and the employer, and it prohibited local governments from picking up the employee's contribution. So the employees really have a skin in the game. They're paying for their benefit, as is their employing agency. But when CalPERS consistently and repeatedly underestimates the cost of the pension by using unrealistic assumptions, they use assumptions that their own experts tell them will be faulty. They are artificially lowering the cost of the pension so the employees aren't picking up their entire 50%. And instead, that debt is getting transferred to the taxpayers. And that's a fundamental flaw, and that needs to be fixed. But getting back to your original question, I think that history will judge Governor Brown very kindly on his approach to pensions. And it's unfortunate that the legislature didn't let him go to where he wanted to go, because had he been able to realize what he originally proposed as pension reform, I think we'd be far better off.
When I worked in the legislature back in the day when Connie Conway was Republican leader, we actually introduced Governor Brown's original plan from 2011 or 2012 as legislation. When do you ever see that the minority party is introducing the governor's plan as legislation, that there's that much, cross-party agreement? So with the governor leaving, we're going to have a new governor and a new legislature next year. What do you think are the prospects for pension reform going forward in this new political dynamic?
Well, first let me say I love Connie Conway. She's a wonderful woman, and I was a council member during the time that she was the leader, and we had the opportunity to chat about a lot of different policy issues, but pensions in particular, and she's sorely missed. As far as the new governor and the new legislature, I don't see the legislature changing much. I mean, the faces will change, but I don't think the policies and the politics at the legislature is going to change significantly at all. So honestly, I don't have a lot of hope there. In the governor's race, we have Gavin Newsom and John Cock. That some people think it's a foregone conclusion that we will have a Governor Gavin. I'm not so sure that is going to be the case, but time will tell. We only have a couple of weeks till the election, so we'll see. How that ends up in the governor's office will be a big determiner of where we go. To be honest, I don't think I almost messed up there myself, Lieutenant Governor Newsom really believes the pension is a serious issue. And I think that when you look at a state that literally owes hundreds of billions of dollars in unfunded pension liabilities, it needs to be addressed. Will he address it in a meaningful way? I'm not optimistic. I think the solution is going to have to come from the courts. And quite frankly, I think eventually the solution is going to come from our mayors and council members across the state, who are the ones who are really bearing the brunt of this financial impact from the pension crisis. So I think that with the League of Cities and the mayors and the city council members, over the next 2 or 3 years, they're all facing budget deficits in a time of we're in a high financial market. We're doing really well everywhere except for government finance, and the culprit is the pension debt. And I think as you see that magnify over the next couple of years, the debt payments are about ready to double over the next 5 or 6 years. They're not going to have any other option but to deal with it head on. So I think we will see something, but I don't expect it to come from the legislature or the governor.
Otto von Bismarck famously said politics is about the art of the possible. So when we talk about pension reform in California, it's always about these legal and political restraints. But there's not a lot of talk of, if we were to reform the system in a fiscally responsible way, what would it look like? What should Californians and what should public employees expect? So I always like to ask ask this question. So if you were made king for a day, what changes would you make to the system? What would the ideal public pension system look like to you?
Well, no state has made me king yet. I'm still waiting for that. But I'll tell you, I've worked very closely with the state of Arizona, the state of Pennsylvania, the state of Michigan, and others on their pension issues. I think Arizona, particularly in the case of their public safety officers and their correctional officers, has done a phenomenal job in reforming their pensions, and they had some very significant problems. Their pensions were 47% funded, so far below what our pensions here in California are funded. They had their cost of living fund, their COLA fund, completely dry up, so retirees were no longer getting any adjustments to their income, and they did a complete overhaul, and they incorporated a lot of key features that I think are important in any type of pension reform. First of all is 50-50 cost sharing, like the Governor Brown put in the Pepper reforms. However, theirs is full 50-50 cost sharing, including administrative costs and any unfunded liabilities. And that's important because if you're going to have a cost sharing agreement, it should be a full cost sharing agreement. They restructured their boards so that their governing board of their pension systems are no longer as political as our CalPERS board is. They now provide employees a choice. Employees who come into the system can choose whether they want to go into a broken pension system or they want to go into a defined contribution plan where they can be in control of their own destiny. I think that's particularly important with 21st century employees who may not be looking at a career like you or I have where we expect to be somewhere 30 or 40 years. They're looking to go have experiences, gain new knowledge and skills, and move on to other jobs. And I think for those employees, that's desperately needed. If you look at our teacher turnover in California, a significant percentage of teachers never vest in the pension system. And when they don't vest and they leave and go to another profession or go to another state, they lose all their employer's contributions into their pension. That's not fair. We're not providing those people, the people who are not 30, 40-year employees, we're not providing them a path to retirement security. So if you're going to have the opportunity to enter the public workforce, you should be able to choose from options that will give you the ability to build your own retirement security if you don't plan on being around for 30 years, or you don't want to take the risk of a pension fund like CalPERS, or the risk that people in LA Works or Loyalton, California are now paying the price of that risk in reduced pension payments. Those are really important. So to sum it up, I think equal cost sharing, not only cost but risk sharing between employers and employees, good governance, options for employees. When you're looking at public pensions, people should be pro-choice. Individual employees, prospective employees should be able to choose how they want their financial future to look, because not everyone's alike. Some people don't need a retirement because their spouse works. Other people may have family wealth, and that's not as concerned. Maybe they're more concerned about money in their pocket today versus retirement tomorrow. Maybe they've already vested in another plan in the private sector. We don't know that, but we treat every public employee alike, like they're widgets that are interchangeable, and that's not the case. So let's show them the respect of allowing them to choose their financial security in retirement.
Finally, and I think we're in a good setting for this in the bar here at the hotel, we love nothing more at PRI than to enjoy a good adult beverage while discussing free market public policy. So it's a bit of an odd place here in Utah where they have different alcohol laws than in California and other states. So I guess to either celebrate or maybe drown your sorrows about our pension reform efforts, what's a favorite wine or beer or cocktail or other beverage that you recommend our listeners should try?
Well, funny you should bring that up, because just yesterday I was part of a pension panel here at SPN, and it's the only panel that had an open bar. And it's some of it was to numb the pain for those who are here to see how bad the situation was. Others was just to drag people in as alluring them in. But I'm more of a whiskey and bourbon drinker. So for me, last night I went to Whiskey Street restaurant right down the way here, had a great dinner, enjoyed a variety of different whiskeys while I was there. And so I say there's a lot to contemplate in our future. Kick back, put your feet up, pour a glass of bourbon, and do some thinking.
So finally, for our listeners, if they want to follow what you're doing or help in your efforts, how can they follow what you're doing and get involved?
Well, you can follow us on Twitter at RSI Now. We're also on Facebook and LinkedIn. Our website is probably probably the best place, retirementsecurityinitiative.org. But for those of you in California, you know I'm pretty opinionated, so you'll see my name pop up here and there. Love to have you. You can follow me as well at Pete Constant. That Pete Constant works on LinkedIn, Facebook, all of them. And if you like barbecue, I am a huge barbecue fanatic. So you might want to follow at iHeartBarbecue Official on Instagram, and you can see some great food to think about to ease your troubles as well.
Well, I will definitely do that. And Pete, thank you so much for chatting with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I love doing it.
Thanks to our guests, Pete Constant and to Tame. You'll find more information on the Retirement Security Initiative at retirementsecurityinitiative.org. We'd also like to invite all our listeners to PRI's annual Sir Anthony Fisher Gala in San Francisco on Saturday, November 10th. Our keynote speaker is none other than author and media commentator Mark Stein. For more details, go to our website at pacificresearch.org. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/PacificResearch1, that's a number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. We hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.